In nearly 4 decades sitting behind a courtroom bench, I thought I had seen every version of arrogance imaginable. I had watched wealthy men stroll into court, convinced their tailored suits could replace humility. 4. I had seen influential business owners act as though financial success exempted them from treating people with basic dignity. But one Thursday morning in October, something happened in my courtroom that stopped me in a way I hadn't experienced in years. A young woman entered that courtroom carrying herself with the unmistakable confidence of someone who believed consequences were for other people. And within minutes, she committed an act so openly disrespectful that the entire room fell into stunned silence. 5 minutes later, she learned something no amount of privilege could ever buy. I want to tell you exactly how it happened, because this was never just a story about a traffic violation. It became something much bigger. It became a story about entitlement reaching its breaking point. About a young woman standing on the edge of a life she didn't yet understand, and about the unexpected grace that sometimes emerges from humiliation and accountability. But before I continue, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this is a story you'll want to hear all the way through. My name is Judge Carol Whitmore. I've served in municipal court in Hartford, Connecticut since 1986. Before becoming a judge, I spent 12 years working as a public defender. I've seen the justice system from nearly every angle possible. I've represented people with nothing to their name. I've stood across from prosecutors holding all the leverage. And when I finally took the bench, I made myself a promise that I would never forget what it felt like to stand on the other side of it. Every morning, I wake up at 5:45. My husband Gerald makes the coffee because after 41 years of marriage, he knows I'm useless before caffeine. I spend about 20 quiet minutes reading on the back porch before the day begins. That ritual matters to me. When your job involves holding people accountable, you have to enter the courtroom centered and clear-headed. Justice should never come from irritation or ego. My courtroom itself is nothing remarkable. Dark wooden benches, harsh fluorescent lights, an American flag that probably should have been replaced years ago. My clerk, Marcus, has worked with me for 19 years, and by now, he understands my habits better than I do. He knows I prefer complicated cases first. He knows honesty will always earn more patience from me than excuses, and he knows there is one thing I absolutely refuse to tolerate: disrespect, not necessarily toward me personally. I can survive that, but disrespect toward the institution itself, toward the process, and toward the people who walk into that room expecting fairness. That Thursday morning, Marcus gave me a look as soon as I arrived. Not the look that signals tragedy. The other one. The look that means a difficult personality is waiting on the docket. I asked him about it. He simply said, "Number 7, Judge. You'll understand." I made a mental note and put on my robe. The first several cases that morning were ordinary enough. A parking disagreement between a tenant and landlord. A speeding ticket involving a legitimate emergency. A noise complaint that unexpectedly turned into a conversation about grief and isolation. That happens more often than people think. Sometimes the paperwork says one thing, while the truth underneath says something else entirely. I've always believed my responsibility is to see the entire human being, not just the citation in front of me. Then Marcus called case number 7, Brianna Hargrove. When she walked into the courtroom, I noticed her immediately. And I want to be honest about that, because first impressions matter in this story. She was probably 24 or 25, beautiful in the polished way people often are when hardship has never truly touched them. Her clothes were expensive. Her hair immaculate. She carried herself like someone entirely unaccustomed to being questioned. She surveyed the courtroom with barely concealed disdain, as though the entire setting was beneath her. She didn't approach the bench with hesitation. She sauntered, and there's a difference. Most people who stand before a judge, even confident people, carry at least some awareness that the room matters. There's usually a sense of gravity, even among those who believe they've done nothing wrong. Brianna Hargrove carried none of that. I looked down at the citation. Red light violation, Farmington and Prospect. 3 weeks earlier, fine amount, $230. I looked back up and said, Miss Hargrove, you've been cited for running a red light on October 3rd at approximately 8:22 a.m. How do you plead? She tilted her head slightly, annoyed by the question itself. Phoo, then she said, my father is Richard Hargrove. I waited, then calmly repeated, how do you plead? For a brief moment, she looked genuinely surprised. 4. Richard Hargrove was one of the most powerful real estate developers in Connecticut. His name appeared on buildings, scholarship funds, hospital wings. In certain circles, his reputation carried tremendous weight. 4. But not in my courtroom. She said, there's obviously been some mistake. I'd like this dismissed. I asked, on what basis? She stared at me with visible confusion. 4. As though she'd used a key that always worked and suddenly found the lock unmoved. I'm telling you it was a mistake, she replied. Do you have evidence? I asked. Witnesses? Video? Documentation contradicting the officer's report? 4. She shook her head. I don't need documentation. My father will. And then it happened. She reached into her designer purse, pulled out the citation, slapped it onto my bench, and with 2 careless fingers flicked it off the edge. 4. The paper floated to the floor between us. The courtroom became utterly silent, not quiet silent, the kind of silence that happens when everyone in a room realizes at the exact same moment that a line has just been crossed. 4. I looked down at the citation lying on the floor. Then I looked back at Brianna Hargrove. She was trying to appear indifferent, but underneath that expression, I saw it. 4. The very first spark of realization that she may have misjudged the situation completely. I never raise my voice in court. I've never believed volume creates authority. Calm certainty does. I said, Miss Hargrove, pick that up. 4. She stared at me. I repeated quietly, pick it up. For a second, I honestly wasn't sure what she would do. The room was so still I could hear the clock ticking above the doorway. Then slowly, she bent down and retrieved the citation. I said, now place it carefully on the corner of my bench using both hands. She obeyed. Thank you, I said. Now listen carefully, because I will explain this once. I paused. 40. What you just did constitutes contempt of court. I take disrespect toward this institution very seriously. I could hold you in contempt immediately. I could remove you from this courtroom and significantly worsen your situation. Faye, another pause. But I'm not going to do that. Not yet. She looked stunned. Because before I decide what happens next, I continued, I want to hear from you. Not about your father, not about his influence or money. Faye, I want to know who you are. I leaned forward slightly. Who is Brianna Hargrove? Not whose daughter are you? Who are you? Something shifted in her face. Now let me pause for a moment and ask you something. 4. Have you ever had someone confront you in a way that forced you to see yourself honestly for the first time? A moment when someone held up a mirror you weren't prepared for? Leave a comment below, because I genuinely want to know. 4. And if this story is affecting you the way it affected everyone in that courtroom, make sure you hit the like button, because what happened next is the part I still think about years later. 4. Brianna stood silently for several long seconds. I watched her carefully. Her composure didn't completely collapse, but it changed shape. Something behind her eyes softened. Then quietly, she said 3 words I never expected. Faye, I don't know. I leaned forward slightly. Tell me about the morning of October 3rd, I said. Not the traffic light. The morning. She looked down at her hands. Then she spoke. I was late, she said. I'm always late. Father arranged a meeting for me. A job opportunity. I didn't even ask for it, but he told everyone I was coming, and I couldn't disappoint him again. I asked softly, again? She nodded faintly. 4. I've been disappointing him for a long time. The entire atmosphere in that courtroom changed. The people sitting on those benches were no longer watching an arrogant young woman challenge a judge. 4. They were watching someone stop performing and start telling the truth. I asked, how long have you been living the life your father created for you? She let out a shaky breath. Probably forever. 4. And how is that working out for you? A broken little laugh escaped her throat. Apparently not very well. I ran a red light and threw paper at a federal judge. Municipal judge, I corrected gently. But yes. 4. Then came the moment I've replayed in my mind countless times since. She looked directly at me and said, I'm sorry, not just for the paper, for all of it. I walked in here acting like the rules didn't apply to me. And honestly, Faye, I've been acting that way for years without even realizing it. I leaned back and let silence settle across the courtroom. Now listen carefully. I am a judge, not a therapist. 4. It is not my responsibility to unpack every emotional wound carried by the people standing before me. But after 38 years on the bench, I've learned something important. The case written on the paper is almost never the real case. 4. The paperwork is only the doorway. The real story is what's behind it. What I saw standing before me that day was not an evil person. I saw a young woman who had inherited every advantage except the one thing that truly matters: a stable sense of self-independence from other people's expectations. She had spent so many years existing as Richard Hargrove's daughter that Brianna Hargrove herself had barely been allowed to exist at all. Faye, that did not excuse her behavior. What she did was wrong. Disrespect toward the court, toward the process, toward the people in that room. It mattered, and I was not going to dismiss it with a lecture and send her home unchanged. 4. But justice and punishment are not the same thing. I believed that as a public defender, and I still believe it now. Punishment causes pain, justice changes direction. And sometimes before you can redirect someone, first have to make them understand exactly where they are. I said, "Miss Hargrove, here is my ruling. The citation stands. You ran the red light. You will pay the $230 fine." Then I continued, "For contempt of court, Faye, I am assigning you 40 hours of community service to be completed within 60 days. I looked directly at her. Not a donation made by your father, not a check written by your family. You personally will complete those hours. 4. You will serve at the Hartford Community Kitchen, where nearly 400 meals are provided every day to people with nowhere else to turn. You will report directly to the director. You will do whatever work is required. 4. And you will return here in 60 days with proof of completion." She nodded slowly. Then I added one final thing. "I am not doing this to humiliate you. 4. I'm doing it because I think you need to stand beside people who survive every day, without privilege, without connections, without someone opening doors for them." I paused. 4. And I think you may meet someone there you've never truly encountered before. She looked confused. "Who? Yourself." She stood motionless for a moment, then she nodded again. 4. But this time it wasn't the nod of someone pretending to cooperate. It was the nod of someone beginning to understand. I struck the gavel. Case closed. Now stay with me, Faye, because what happened afterward is the reason I've never forgotten this story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. I have many stories from these decades on the bench, and this one still stays with me more than most. Honestly, 4. I didn't expect Brianna Hargrove to change. I expected compliance. I expected her to complete the hours reluctantly and disappear back into her old life exactly as before. I've seen plenty of people treat community service like paying a parking ticket. Minimum effort, minimum reflection. But that isn't what happened. 60 days later, she returned to my courtroom, and she looked different. Foyer. Not only physically, though that was true too. Simpler clothes, less polish, more ease. But the real difference was internal. The entitlement that had entered my courtroom 2 months earlier had loosened its grip. 4. It wasn't completely gone. 40 hours cannot erase an entire lifetime of conditioning, but it no longer dominated her. I asked her to tell me about her experience. She was quiet for a moment before speaking. 4. There's a woman there named Dolores, she said. She's 67. She lost her apartment after the building was sold and the rent increased beyond what she could pay. She comes to the kitchen every day, not just for food. 4. She helps set tables. She talks to lonely people. She remembers everyone's name. Brianna paused. I asked her once why she kept helping when she was struggling herself. And what did she say? I asked. She said, "Faye, because this is the only place where I feel like I belong somewhere." The courtroom stayed silent, then Brianna continued. I've belonged to prestigious schools and clubs my whole life. My father sits on boards all over this city. My name opens doors constantly, but I don't think I've ever truly felt like I belonged anywhere. I asked quietly. And now? She looked at me. I went back after my hours were finished. Twice already. I'm going again Saturday. 4. I'll admit something to you. That moved me. Not because I'm unfamiliar with transformation. I've seen it happen before, though rarely. What affected me was the detail. The way she spoke about Dolores. Fee. The way she noticed small things. It told me she hadn't merely shown up physically, she had paid attention, and paying attention is where all real change begins. I later confirmed her hours with Patricia, Fee, the director of the Hartford Community Kitchen. Patricia had run that place for more than 2 decades and had zero patience for people treating service like a performance. Along with the verification form, Patricia attached a handwritten note. It read, "This one is going to be okay." I kept that note. I looked at Brianna and said, "The court considers your obligations fulfilled." She thanked me. Then she surprised me again. "Form, Judge Whitmore," she said. "I owe you an apology I should have given you 2 months ago." She took a breath. "What I did with that paper wasn't really about you." I was angry and frightened. A and I lashed out at the nearest authority figure. "That doesn't excuse it. You deserved better. Everyone in this courtroom deserved better. I'm sorry." I studied her for a long moment. Then I said, "Apology accepted. Now do something meaningful with what you've learned." She nodded and walked away. And I noticed something as she left. The people watching her weren't looking at her with judgment. They were looking at her with grace. Several months later, I attended a charity dinner hosted by the Hartford Bar Association. Halfway through the evening, Patricia from the community kitchen approached my table. She sat beside me and smiled. "Judge Whitmore," she said, "that young woman you sent to us has done something remarkable." I asked what she meant. Patricia explained that Brianna had continued volunteering long after her required hours ended. But more importantly, she had finally begun using her connections for something real. She convinced several of her father's wealthy associates to donate funds that expanded the kitchen's operating hours. She personally organized a fundraiser instead of handing it off to professionals. She brought together people from entirely different worlds. And during that fundraiser, she stood up publicly and admitted that a judge had forced her to confront herself honestly for the first time in her life. She said it with her father sitting in the audience. I asked Patricia how Richard Hargrove reacted. Patricia smiled. "He wrote the largest check of the night," she said. And afterward, I heard him tell her he was proud of her. She paused. For the first time, he was proud of something she had actually chosen for herself. I had to step away from the table after hearing that. And now I want to ask you something sincerely. If this story has affected you, share it. Send it to someone raising a child who needs to understand the difference between privilege and entitlement. Send it to someone afraid of the courtroom. Send it to someone who believes accountability only exists through cruelty. For me, and subscribe, because after 38 years behind that bench, I still have stories worth telling. Let me leave you with what I believe after all this time. Entitlement is not born inside people naturally. It is taught. It grows in environments where someone is repeatedly shown that rules apply to everyone else, but not to them. Where wealth, status, or influence create a false sense of exemption. And strangely enough, that kind of privilege can become its own form of poverty because it disconnects people from genuine human connection. The people most trapped by it are often the ones living inside it. People with every opportunity imaginable who still feel empty and disconnected. What I tried to do for Brianna Hargrove that day, and what I try to do in every courtroom case, is see the entire human being, not just the offense, not just the contempt, not just the mistake, the whole person. Because justice only matters when it recognizes humanity completely. The $230 fine addressed the red light violation. The 40 hours addressed something far deeper. It introduced a young woman to a version of herself that had never fully existed before. A version capable of standing beside Dolores setting tables. A version capable of helping people because she truly cared. A version capable of speaking honestly about who she was without hiding behind her father's name. That person had always existed inside Brianna Hargrove. She simply needed someone unwilling to be intimidated, impressed, or bought. That is what this bench is for, not punishment, justice. And when justice is carried out with wisdom and compassion, it does more than resolve a case. It changes lives on difficult days. Fonitor, when the system feels exhausting and imperfect and heavy, I think about Dolores setting tables at that kitchen. I think about a young woman finally speaking truthfully. I think about a father telling his daughter he was proud of her. Faye, and I remember why this work matters. Every single day, it matters. Thank you for listening. Take care of one another. Offer grace when you can. And remember, the rules exist for everyone equally. That isn't oppression. 4. It's the foundation of a world where everyone has a place. God bless you.